Welcome everybody. We'll just let everyone get joined up and then we'll aim to start probably a couple minutes after. There's quite a few people registered, so it's very exciting, but we'll make sure to get as many people in as possible. Welcome again to people just joining us. We're just doing a waiting time until everyone joins, and we'll probably start just a couple minutes after. Thank you. For one, people still join, so I think we'll just wait a few more seconds. Okay, we're getting to that time. I think we might as well call it, and people can join as they will. We are recording, so if anyone missed anything, this talk will be available on our YouTube channel after, and we can share with everyone then as well. So thank you so much for joining us. This is a really great topic, and that was definitely made evident by the registration, so thank you all for joining us. And just a quick introduction to the Carbon Leadership Forum. We're the Alberta hub, but we are part of the larger part of the Carbon Leadership Forum .org. If you visit their website, there's many resources and studies on carbon, including items on policy, which we're talking about here today. Please see clfalberta.com. You can sign up to be part of our mailing list, and you can be kept in the loop about upcoming events. And then you can also see that our next event is scheduled, which is very exciting. November 4th, we will be talking about the circular economy with Stephanie from Dialogues. So more about that, and you'll see more about that upcoming. But for today, we are talking about embodied carbon policy at the City of Edmonton with Shawn and Justin and Andrea. So I will pass it right over to them for an intro and a start. So thank you very much for joining us.
Fantastic, thank you. I will hopefully share the correct screen here. Okay, can you see my screen, Kristen?
I sure can, thank you, yeah.
Fantastic. Great, well, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrea Linsky, and we're here to present today about work that we've done at the City of Edmonton around embodied carbon. I'm a senior engineer at the City of Edmonton, and I do a lot of work around developing and implementing our corporate greenhouse gas management related work. And that includes the policy side as well as the actual implementation of that policy. I'm here today with my colleagues Shawn and Justin, who sit with me on the climate resilient building team. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that team as we proceed. And maybe I'll have Shawn and Justin just introduce themselves briefly here as well.
Hi, my name is Shawn Allers. I'm the Senior Mechanical Engineer and General Supervisor for Facility Engineering, and I just provide technical support to Andrea. Justin?
Thanks. And I'm Justin Phill. I'm the Senior Green Building and Energy Code Engineer here at the City of Edmonton with the Safety Permits and Inspections Group. So my job's everything energy code related, and the green building part means I get roped into a whole bunch of other initiatives and got to help out with the sustainability policy, which is great.
Fantastic. So I think where we'll step into here is what we're going to cover today. Our focus for the first part of this will be on the policy, and I hope to tell you a story about how we actually developed our corporate policy and the embodied carbon pieces that are linked into that. Anyone who's worked in the policy world knows that policy is only as good as its implementation approach. So we'll talk a little bit about that piece as well. Shawn will then dive into the research and development process we did for the actual policy language itself. And then Justin will talk about the next steps that we have around embodied carbon policy at the city and where we hope to go from there. The next piece will be questions that we have. So actually, we're going to ask you some questions, and then hopefully, if you have questions for us, we'll do our best to answer them as well. But before we get started here, I think Kristen has a bit of a survey to get things moving here. We'd like to know who we're talking to. I always talk a little bit better when I know who we're speaking to. So if you could fill out the poll and let us know what industry you're coming from, that would be great. Thank you. Just give a minute here for everyone to participate.
May have spelled government wrong. May have.
I didn't do it. For those who know me, it's usually me that does the spelling wrong. Okay. Perfect. So we're sharing the results now. So it looks like we've got a bunch of our colleagues from the city here and perhaps other municipalities, as well as some manufacturers, which is great to see. because that's where we're going to need a lot of your information as we move forward from. So great, thanks, that's perfect. So let's see if I can. Okay, so I said that we would start with the story, and the story of carbon management at the city, or greenhouse gas management at the city, is not a new one. It's been around for decades. We've been working on this work, but for the purposes of the embodied carbon discussion, I think it makes sense to start in 2018 when we hosted the IPC Cities Conference. And this conference wasn't just any IPCC's conference. This was the first one that actually looked at how cities are expected to play a role in the climate emergency, essentially. And this conference actually led to two really key pieces of work that were done at the city. The first one is the development of what's called the Edmonton Declaration. And there's been hundreds of municipalities around the world who have signed on to the Edmonton Declaration and the work that they do. That Edmonton Declaration has a few different pieces in it, but one of the key pieces is about how municipalities, not just federal or international or provincial entities, have an actual role in doing our part to contain climate change's impacts to 1.5 degrees of global warming. So that really puts the onus on municipalities to step up in doing the work that needs to be done. The other big piece of work that came out of the IPCC conference was that the City of Edmonton declared a climate emergency, and that was in August of 2019. So these two pieces really sort of set the tone for the strategy and policy work that's done across the city. And I know that we're not the only municipalities that have signed on to the Edmonton Declaration or have declared climate emergencies. So at the same time as all of this was going on, we actually were in the process of revising our city plan at the City of Edmonton. And it was really fantastic timing in the sense that we had the ability to do a lot of the modeling that was necessary to help meet that 1.5 degree target that we had identified, and put that directly into the city plan, setting some really hard targets for ourselves. So one of the first big things that we talk about a lot at the city is developing a carbon budget that we have. So that's the maximum amount of carbon we're allowed to consume. It's not per year, it's just, that's it, the carbon budget, and when it's gone, it's gone. And we also have net per person greenhouse gas emission targets as well. And so those are some of the many pieces in the city plan that sort of help direct us. And when we talk about policy, if you spend time in the policy world, it's all about setting that higher level of policy that allows for the action, the movement below that. So the big city move greener as we grow is the one that's most often referred to in our lower levels of policy at the city when it comes to this work. So one of the big pillars of the city plan and our high level strategy documents at the city is climate resilience. And we talk about climate resilience at the city as something that covers two really key important pieces. It talks about both mitigation and adaptation around climate change. Many people will see climate resilience and think solely of the adaptation side, but at the City of Edmonton, we're talking about both what we can do to mitigate our impact, our climate impacts, and also how we're going to be adapting to it as we move forward. So at the city, we have two key pieces of strategy that have been developed that are both required by legislation, but they focus on how we mitigate our emissions through the Edmonton Community Energy Transition Strategy and Action Plan. And then the adaptation strategy and action plan is how we're adapting to it. And the energy transition strategy is the first piece of documentation that you actually see embodied carbon referenced. So all of these higher pieces that I've been talking about are sort of set the tone for the language in these lower pieces of policy work. So this is where you see it the first time as it comes up. This is clipped directly from our energy transition strategy. And Justin will go through this in a little bit more detail later, but we have numerous pathways that we go through in the energy transition strategy. And one of them is emissions neutral buildings. And we have a strategy in there that says that we must support low embodied carbon buildings and infrastructure as a city. And so that's not only in our own city buildings, which we point out below below here, the city leads by example by implementing embodied carbon disclosure into procurement process of building materials and products. But it also talks about how we're going to help the rest of the community do that as well. So all of industry in the City of Edmonton boundaries. And that's about encouraging voluntary reporting of emissions, embodied carbon emissions in new constructions. So those are the current two big targets that we've set. The city-owned infrastructure is happening right now. That's what we're presenting on today. And the remainder of the community is a target that we're going to be moving towards. And Justin will talk about that piece as well. So the climate resilience policy and procedures are some documentation that was developed to support the strategy documents that I just talked about. So to provide a bit of clarity here, once we had these new targets that were set out in the energy transition strategy, the revised version of it, to align with these targets that we discussed at the IPCC conferences, we had to update a lot of our policy to align with these new targets. And so what we did is we actually merged two key pieces of policy at the city. And for any of you who happen to be from firms that we've done construction work with in the past, you'll recognize C532 as our sustainable building policy. And this set criteria in the past for how we build our new buildings at the city, amongst quite a few other things. Our energy transition policy was actually the policy that gave us the authority to do the work within the strategies that I had talked about. So what we did is we merged these two pieces of policy. They're now obsolete. And we were also dealing with something that was coming into play at the city called our corporate policy framework. And so that was basically helping us determine what types of policies had to happen at different levels. And one of the findings that we had when we were looking at this analysis was that essentially the policy that is being approved by council, which is this climate resilient policy, C627, the new policy, couldn't have the types of detailed procedural pieces that currently existed in the C532 or our sustainable building policy, because council is not allowed to direct administration. It's one of those sort of nuanced pieces. So basically what it allowed us to do was it put a little bit more flexibility into things. And I'm going to talk about the value of the hierarchies of policy and how they help us meet our goals. But the climate resilience policy was set in stone by council. And then we developed 6 administrative procedures that were all approved by our senior leadership within the city. And those 6 procedures focus on our buildings and the way we manage and build our buildings at the City of Edmonton. So they're our city-owned assets. You see 6 now, but come back in 10 years, I bet you there'll be a whole bunch more administrative procedures that talk about things beyond just our city assets. And part of the reason I'm pointing that out is because the climate resilience policy itself isn't just about our city assets. It's about all of the pieces I've been talking about today. So we have 3 core pieces of that policy work. It talks about our goals to act to reduce emissions by 35% by 25, 50% by 2030, and a carbon neutral community by 2050. So that's about our mitigation for the entire community. And then we have the second item here, which is acting to adapt and prepare for and respond to a changing climate. So that's about the adaptation side, and that's for the entire community as a whole as well. And then finally, my favorite part is the leading climate solutions and service delivery and corporate management. So this is how we lead by example and sort of support industry as it moves towards these higher 2 goals that we've listed here. And that's where the work that we're doing, talking about today, really fits into. So if we take a look back here at the climate resilience policy, you notice the 6 different procedures that came out of them. They focus on new design of buildings, how we manage our existing buildings, how we purchase buildings, how we lease buildings as a tenant, how we lease buildings as a landlord, and how we fund buildings that we might not own. And these are all about the sustainability practices within these areas. The embodied carbon piece right now fits very squarely in the new design piece for us. So in the new design and construction piece, we have a whole bunch of different targets, and Shawn's going to talk about like how we essentially had to balance our work in just determining what we put into the procedure. But embodied carbon disclosure is one of the requirements for all new construction at the City of Edmonton. In addition to the embodied carbon piece, we also talk about operational carbon, as you can imagine. And so we have emissions neutral building requirement for all new construction at the city that's over 600 square meters. We have a 20% more energy efficient than NECB 2017 requirement. We have a TEDI or thermal energy demand intensity requirement of less than 80 for most of our buildings. And for those of you who are familiar with these standards, we're also at 50 for our office buildings. We have a LEED silver requirement, and part of the reason we still lean quite a bit on LEED is because it allows us, we're using their climate adaptation credits to start looking at climate resilience in these buildings from an adaptation perspective. So doing climate risk assessments as is outlined in LEED really allow us to look at the changing climate and how we're building to adapt to that. And we still have our renewable energy requirement piece as well. So if for those of you who are familiar with that, we've always required on-site renewable energy to be built into our new buildings. So we're not going to focus on all of those ones below, but that's another presentation for another forum. But today we'll focus on the embodied carbon piece and how we got to that point. So the question you've all been dying to hear is, what's the actual policy language around embodied carbon, what's being required, and this is where the policy cascade discussion happens. And you'll see we're gonna take you on a bit of a wild goose chase. So the procedure language itself says that all new construction shall require embodied carbon assessments as outlined in the city's facility design and construction manual. And so it's like, okay, well now I got to go find the design and construction manual. I'll take you there in a minute, but the other piece we've put into the procedure is all around the new construction requirement to using the material with the lowest embodied carbon for an otherwise equivalent materials. They need to consider that, and they need to document that consideration. And so what we wanted to do here was do a little bit more than just requiring disclosure. We wanted to ask parties that if we really have two different materials at hand that you could be choosing, and all other things being considered equal, pick the one with the lower embodied carbon. Like it should be a no-brainer, but that was what we were essentially asking people to start consider, and to document that process, like how they're making those decisions about the different products that they're using. The designing construction consultant manual is where you then go to find the details, and in there it says it refers us to our professional service agreement. So that's the actual contract that we have with the consultant to do that work. And so we've actually downloaded the language yet again to this lower level of documentation on exactly what the formal requirements are. And there's a reason we've done that. So when we start looking at hierarchies of policy in an organization, you have to sort of tread this fine line of figuring out at what level do you put in something that's so hard coded that it can't get undone by future decision makers, right? So that would be that high level city plan material and the work that was approved by council as a policy. Those are very difficult documents to change. And so that's why we put in those high level requirements at that level. But then when you get into things like even the procedures are approved by senior leadership at the city. So in that level of documentation, we say embodied carbon must be disclosed. So you put in that high level piece there. And then especially when you're working with concepts that are kind of groundbreaking or really flexible in the fact that we're learning as a city of what we actually want, you want to kind of download the details to something that's much more flexible. So the professional service agreement is actually just the contract with the builder, essentially, like the consultants that we're working with, that says this is what you have to deliver to us. And so by putting the language in that, it allows us to switch it from consultant to consultant, depending on what we learn learned from our first experience. And so that's part of what we're going to show you today is like the draft language we have that we're going to be putting into these agreements, and that they might change over time. But by downloading it to this level, it allows us to be flexible in that type of work that we do. And so, but at the same time, we still have this high level requirement that requires we do the disclosure, and that'll be really difficult for leadership or anyone else to sort of decide isn't as important for us to do anymore, right? So in my last few slides here before Shawn and Justin get in here, I wanted to talk a bit about our implementation. So as I mentioned, we've got all this policy. What if nobody follows it? What if nobody actually does the work that needs to be done? And so that's why we have something called the Climate Resilient Building Team at the city. It's an in-house group of subject matter experts. I think a lot of them are on the call here today, so thanks for joining us. And they are from all parts of the city. But our primary role is about maintaining these procedures and making sure that that we're there to sort of be the subject matter experts and help people as they start taking on this work. So often what we'll do is we'll take consultation from people within the city that are saying, I don't understand the policy, or the procedures, I don't understand how it applies to my specific project. I don't understand if it applies to my specific projects. And we also are very keen to talk with consultants who are working with the city on projects, if they want to understand what we're looking for or how we're getting there. So we're the team that is sort of there to support consultation and capacity building, both internally, but also in industry. And then the second piece is that we are also there to provide sort of a structure and guidance to leadership. So as subject matter experts, we can review an exception request that comes in saying, I don't want to follow this policy, or I can't follow this policy. We would review it, provide a technical recommendation to leadership saying, yes, we agree, this part of the policy doesn't need to be followed, or this part of the procedure doesn't need to be followed for this particular project. Or we could say, no, we disagree. We think they should be doing this type of work. And just because the budget isn't available isn't a good enough reason not to do that kind of work, right? And so we provide a recommendation to leadership. Leadership makes a decision. So this Climate Resilient Building Team doesn't have the authority to make that kind of decision, but we do inform leadership. We also have a responsibility to report regularly on these exceptions. So the committee tracks whether or not exceptions are being provided, and we report that to leadership, both to the city manager and to city council, so that they can see whether or not we're actually abiding by the policies that have been set. The next question I always get, and I'm sure there's already an email in my inbox asking this, is when does this policy come into effect? And the answer is it already has. So in June 10th is when our leadership team approved those procedures. The policy itself was approved a few weeks before that. And so basically that means that any project that has had an agreement, or that service the PSA developed for it before June 10th would follow C532, our prior policy for this type of work, which does not have an embodied carbon requirement in it. And anything after June 10th is required to follow the embodied carbon piece, as well as all the changes that were made to the policy. Although I will say that things are still in progress, right? So because we're still learning and we're still trying to figure out exactly what kind of information we're gathering and what it'll look like from the disclosure point of view, the changes in what people are going to be requested to provide will sort of slowly phase in over time as we start to understand the work better, and the support we can give to people when they're asking us these questions as well, right? So that's it for me. I'm going to hand it off to Shawn now to sort of explain how we got to the point we're at now.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrea. We'll give you a break here. So I'm going to take us back a little bit into how we got here, how we decided to put embodied carbon into the policy and what it should look like. We started off with a bit of a jurisdictional scan, an investigation into embodied carbon. Initially, it just started off gaining knowledge on life cycle studies. And it turns out some of these webinars, which were titled life cycle studies, really had a very strong focus on embodied carbon. Some of the first ones we looked at were from the US Department of Energy, from the Building Technology Office. And they were webinars on life cycle impacts. There were actually a series of 5 webinars, which are still viewable if people want to have a look at them. But in the first one, the presenter was a lady by the name of Kate Simonin, who I'd never heard of at the time, but she was promoting a small organization called the Carbon Leadership Forum. And in the first webinar, she also kept referencing an embodied carbon benchmark study, which we'll dig into a little deeper here in a few slides. Could go to the next slide, please, Andrea. So as part of the jurisdictional scan, we looked at what Toronto and Vancouver were doing, as they tend to be leaders in these subject areas. Toronto, as part of their green standard, was requiring a material emissions assessment for the structure and envelope. It was only focused on the first stages of a building's life cycle, basically product manufacturing and building construction. Toronto referenced the CAGBC Zero Carbon Building Standard V2 methodology on how to conduct the study, which was interesting because the Zero Carbon Building Standard included a procedure for a full LCA analysis rather than just sort of looking at the first few stages. But it did include requirements like the assessment had to include a list of recommendations that were considered or implemented to reduce the embodied carbon based on the final design. And it gave assumptions like a building service life of 60 years and other items. So then we looked at Vancouver. Vancouver City Council had actually set a target of reducing embodied carbon emissions by 40% by 2030, which was impressive. You know, on the assessment reporting side, Vancouver didn't specifically call out embodied carbon reporting on its own, but it did include it within a full life cycle assessment. It was within their green buildings policy for rezoning. That life cycle assessment, again, focused primarily on envelope and structural components, again, excluding mechanical, electrical, like Toronto. Their assessment called for it to be done on the whole life cycle of the building. In terms of specifics, it mentioned that some of the LCA tools, such as the Athena Impact Estimator and others, could be used, but it mandated the use of the US EPA tool for the reduction and assessment of technical and other environmental impacts, TRACI. They also had a specific checklist of items that they were looking for. One interesting option Vancouver had put out there is if you were pursuing LEED V4, you didn't have to worry about the TRACI or some of the other stuff. You could just complete the building life cycle impact reduction credit option 4 in LEED V4 and then not have to do any of the other requirements. Next slide, please. So we also consulted with industry to understand what is being done on some of these projects in terms of embodied carbon. How much does an embodied carbon analysis cost? If we're going to add it into the policy, when does it get done? So some of the info we received indicated they were generally being done at schematic design or schematic design and design development, but it was still very new. Some of the costs initially that were given to us were around $10,000 for an assessment at SD or $25,000 for an assessment at SD, DD, and including some tender elements, but there was some variation there. We also reviewed what the LEED V4 building disclosure credit had to say in terms of standards of, you know, ISO and types of EPDs and generally see what CAGBC recommended for LEED. Basically, the building life cycle impact reduction credit option 4 was a full building life cycle assessment where you had to show a 10% reduction in global warming potential or eutrophication, basically 3 out of these 5 categories compared to a reference building. And then still with CAGBC, we reviewed the zero carbon building standard, which is discussed for Toronto on the last slide, included a procedure for a full life cycle analysis. Next slide, please. So once the jurisdictional scan was done, it was time to dig into the numbers and see what embodied carbon looked like. So going back a few slides to those Department of Energy webinars and the embodied carbon benchmark study published by the Carbon Leadership Forum in 2017, it gave some general ideas on the embodied carbon per square meter of building. Now, there are a lot of caveats here. The numbers in that study are based on a pile of other studies, and it's only initial embodied carbon of the primary building components. And the lots of studies that the aggregate one was built on had different methodologies. And there were some other issues, but at least it gave us a place to start. And so one of the 4 major findings of that report was that for commercial office buildings, the initial embodied carbon in the structure, foundation, and enclosure was between 200 and 500 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per meter squared for about 50% of the buildings in their database. And then digging a little deeper into the report, one of the figures showed a median embodied carbon of 400 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent per meter squared for a variety of different building types, including lodging, healthcare, education, office, public assembly, etc. Next slide, please. So with some of these numbers from the previous slide in mind, we went back to our city buildings. Now, we had about 65 different energy audits done over the last 6 years, which included all different archetypes for city buildings. From this energy audit data, we calculated our operational carbon or greenhouse gas intensity for these buildings. Initially, we used our current electrical grid factor, which is around 0.45 kilograms CO2 per kilowatt hour, and the usual natural gas factor, excluding methane losses and distribution. The range we found for GHGI was around 100 to 800 kilograms CO2 equivalent per meter squared at this grid factor, with some of the libraries and the offices in the lower end, and some of the recs, centers, and transit centers on the higher end. Can you go to the click one more? So when compared to the median embodied carbon, which we show there on the red line, referenced previously, a lot of these buildings would generate more operational carbon in their first year of operation than the initial embodied carbon in all of their parts. So this made us think that operational carbon was still quite important for these buildings. But then the question was asked, well, our grid factor is going to improve. So how will that change things? Next slide, please. So we ran the numbers again, this time at a grid factor of 0.25 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour, which is what we expect the grid factor to be at around 2024 and likely stabilize permanently around that number moving forward. So at this lower electrical grid factor and using the same natural gas factor definitely improved things. The GHGI for all of the buildings reduced substantially. And now the overall range was between about 50 and 400 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent per meter squared. One more click, please. So going back to our embodied carbon, that meant it was taking between 1 to 8 years of operating to equal the embodied carbon in the building, based on the median from the Carbon Leadership Forum report. So definitely the embodied carbon was very important, but also considering these buildings tend to last 50 or more years, the operational carbon was still something worth prioritizing and keeping in mind for the policy. So from this data, we made some decisions, which you'll see in a few slides down the road, but first I'm going to pass it over to Justin.
Perfect. Thanks, Shawn. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Kristen, for everything so far. So I'm going to talk a little more about the long-term emission goals that the city has from both city-owned infrastructure and community perspective as well. So as Andrea mentioned earlier in the presentation, the City of Edmonton's energy transition strategy has a goal to achieve net zero per person greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 for all new and existing infrastructure. So there are 4 pathways we're following to achieve this. They're on the screen here. So renewable and resilient energy transition, emissions neutral buildings, low carbon city and transportation, and carbon capture and nature-based solutions. So the work that we've been discussing today focuses on that second path, which is emissions neutral buildings. We've focused on operational carbon in our buildings with a lot of the work that we've done recently. But more and more, we're hearing about the importance of addressing embodied carbon. And we've been talking a lot about embodied carbon in our buildings, but we also have to start to consider how we're going to address embodied carbon of the city's non-building assets. So things like LRT infrastructure, so the tracks and lines and everything else that goes with it outside of the main buildings. So that's a topic for another time. So on the next slide, going back to our buildings, the energy transition strategy outlines 2 strategies related to embodied carbon. And Andrea touched on these before. So the first one is to support low embodied carbon buildings and infrastructure. The second is that the city leads by example by implementing embodied carbon disclosure into procurement processes of building materials and products. So we're trying to do 2 things with the embodied carbon requirements in the new climate resilience policy. The first is to gather embodied carbon data so we have a better idea as a building owner of what data is out there, what level of detail is out there, and for what types of products. At this point, it's kind of a we don't know what we don't know kind of thing. Once we get more data, we'll be able to refine what we need and what we're looking for and work with industry to develop better data. And we want to eventually use this data to develop policy, both in regards to city-owned buildings, but also possibly extending policy to community buildings as well. We also want to use the data to drive design choices for our buildings, as Andrea mentioned before. Given everything else equal, embodied carbon would win in material selection. So next slide, please. Just going back to some of the community stuff. In 2019, we started on some industry engagement and technical analysis to chart a path to emissions neutral buildings by 2030 for all new construction in Edmonton, but only from an operational perspective. We heard from industry that education, incentives, and city leadership are important to achieve this goal. And now with the new climate resilience policy, we have to walk the talk and show that we're leaders by constructing emissions neutral buildings ourselves. So what we're working on right now is developing targets between now and 2030, possibly using a metric like greenhouse gas intensity or GHGI to keep us on track toward that goal. So GHGI is the total greenhouse gas emissions from the building divided by the building's floor area. And the topic of embodied carbon came up during this engagement process as well. So that raises the question, should we eventually tie in both operational and embodied carbon into these GHGI targets? Should they stay as separate targets? And with the data from the new climate resilience policy, hopefully we'll get some of the answers and we can begin to develop some internal and external policy as required. So next slide. On the schedule for 2022 is to form an emissions neutral building industry advisory group. So what we're hoping this group will do is provide input on what education, what incentives or policy tools are required to meet the emissions goals that the city has. While the focus for the near term is operational carbon, I would expect the discussions will eventually include embodied carbon as well. So that's all I have. So we have a few questions for you. So if you want to keep these in mind while we share the policy wording on the next slide. This is really our first opportunity to share this language with the industry that we have in our PSAs, and we'd love to hear your feedback on them. So I think a poll just came up, so maybe take a minute to answer that question there. All right, half the audience is familiar and know the different types of EPDs. That's awesome to hear. Perfect, so did we wanna go on the next slide? So here is the proposed guidance and the wording that we have in our PSAs. I don't know if I want to read through the entire thing, so I'll just go through the couple of highlighted details here. So the embodied carbon analysis that we're looking for is we'll capture product stage A. So the beginning of the life cycle, A1 through A5. The analysis will include all of the envelope and structural elements that are in the couple of lines after that highlighted part. And what we're asking for is studies to utilize valid type 3 EPDs where available and provide each EPD used in digital, machine readable format if available. And that last paragraph we've mentioned a couple times, so I'll let that one be.
So I think with that, we're really keen to hear from you in that this is, it's interesting in the development of our presentation for you today, the language in this changed a few times as we were learning more about, what we probably want to be asking industry. And so I think that's one of the things that we'd love to hear your thoughts on if you have some comments. And as well, I think we're really happy to take any questions. Oh, and I did cut Justin off there, so I'll let Justin finish up before we do that.
One more slide, right. So the next steps is to provide clarity and guidance for embodied carbon disclosure on our upcoming projects. We want to build capacity with our city staff to review disclosure reports, so doing like internal roadshows on embodied carbon, just the PSA requirements to provide more clarity and support. We want to work with local entities to identify gaps in EPD availability to support product category rule development. So I'm sure some people on the call here could help us out with that. And use learnings from civic building requirements to inform voluntary disclosure programs for the greater community. And that is it for us. So we'd love to get into the discussions or answer any questions.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much to all three of you. That's fantastic. I really appreciated personally the background to where you got there and what got you there in the first place. There are some questions already in the chat. Some of them came up during Shawn's portion there. The first one, I think, was looking for the years that were associated with the grid factors. I know you said 2024 for one, but maybe for the 0.45, there's another year.
I'm going to let Andrea, I get all my grid factors and grid factor predictions from Andrea. So I'm going to let Andrea field those ones.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I don't know the exact years that Shawn pulled here. I'd have to look it up, but the 2045 is, 0.45 is currently what we're working for, I think, for 2021. If I think that's probably where you pulled it from, or maybe it's the 2020 value. The 0.25, I'm not sure what year we hit that. I'd have to go back and look at the chat, but it's probably around 20. It's probably a figure we would use around 2030. But we do our forecasting for the emissions factors. We're now actually these are probably from our old source, but we're going to be shifting to the federally provided values. So I'm happy to share those because they're publicly provided for each different province in Alberta. It's developed by the federal government.
Great. And then I think everything else was great discussion and great feedback. And then there was one other question. Will there be any required reduction in embodied carbon for new builds moving forward? Example, 40% over the 2018 baseline might sound familiar. So I guess that was probably on your earlier slides there.
Justin? The answer is that we don't know yet. At this point, disclosure is all that's required as part of the energy transition strategy. But we do have this is about that discussion of the higher levels of policy, right? So we still do have at that higher level a requirement to be reducing our embodied carbon. So at some point when we're ready to move forward with that, we will, but and it's appropriate, we would, but at this point, we're not there yet.
I think we wanted to start at the beginning. I think there needed to be a little bit of capacity building on the consultant side. A lot of the people in this seminar probably know all about embodied carbon, but when we go to a lot of our design teams that are just working on our regular projects, it's still a very new thing. And to just have them at least look at a product declaration sheet for different materials and compare them really was part of one of the goals here in terms of setting this language, rather than going too far down the road of setting a target or requiring a full life cycle analysis or some of these other things. But this is the sort of feedback we're looking for in terms of what other individuals think. So feel free to put your feedback out there. We will absolutely look at it, all of it.
Fantastic. And then Anthony, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, great to see the City of Edmonton working on this. And I like the ideas around how to make it so that it's more flexible, like where you actually put this policy. So I think that was a really interesting idea of how to structure this. I just wanted to make a quick comment around the embodied carbon benchmarks. So for instance, when you're looking at that CLF benchmarking study, that's aggregating studies from many different consultants and all around the world with different underlying databases and assumptions. But one key thing I think that to keep in mind is how is the floor area defined in those benchmarks? Because I think oftentimes there's not a lot of clarity in that, and in particular, whether or not it includes parkade area. Because if you think about operational GHGI, you're oftentimes not including that parkade area. And so if the embodied carbon benchmarks, which would be a lot more aligned if we included those parkade areas, because it's it kind of reduces the distribution of results. If you then don't include parkade area, that can lead to much bigger differences. And like we've worked on projects where the typical results can go higher than 500 or even get up to like 600, 700, 800. And mind you, that's still only including just the structure and the envelope. There's a lot of other scopes that aren't being included right now. And so the total picture can increase quite a bit, as we're seeing some early estimates around MEP systems. There are numbers that are like in the 100, 200, 300 ranges, depending on the building type. Same thing with interiors and how we account for that. Also, when you're doing an LCA, like what is the actual material, how do they arrive at those material quantities? So for example, if they're using a tool like Athena, which is commonly used, it's a free whole building LCA tool. They have very simplified assumptions around how they build up those assemblies. And sometimes you can't even like quantify the thickness of your concrete slab. So what do you do if you have a big giant transfer slab that's like a meter thick or something like that, or however thick, right? So there's a big difference between like actually capturing those quantities from like a Revit model versus something that uses a lot of simplified assumptions and may actually drastically underestimate the material quantities. So those are just, but I think it was really interesting to see those operational GHGI numbers from Edmonton, and also to see it on the future grid factors. I think that was really interesting. And one last point that I wanted to actually ask about was, or maybe not ask about, but you mentioned requiring not just a disclosure, but for the consultants to evaluate the lowest embodied carbon material alternative, as assuming that it's functionally equivalent. I really like the intent of that. Although I think if you say it's the lowest, you may be very specific about as to like what product you're actually considering there, whereas there could be a wide range of different products that are lower. And maybe another way of structuring that is potentially asking, like, for instance, if you're following something like the LEED guidance on the LCA credit, where you're doing a whole building LCA and you're requiring a certain percentage reduction, maybe one way of structuring that is, can you actually show us a scenario where you reduce 10% or 20% and not committing to that, but then you're looking at different strategies that are not even just limited to material substitutions. Maybe they're doing things to like, change the structural grid or some other material efficiency measures where they can kind of achieve that on a whole building basis. So that could be one other way of structuring it without kind of requiring that reduction. Thanks.
Thank you. I see Andrea writing furiously. Thank you for your feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah, Anthony is our life cycle assessment expert, so that's great. The questions are flying in. One from Tim: will policy direction be in place to inform the 2023 to 2026 capital budget discussions?
Yes, so this policy already is in place, and it is informing the capital budget discussion. So part of the analysis that we did in developing the policy, and you can imagine it wasn't a small part, it's basically what certain people, that's all they wanted to know, is how much more will this cost. So part of the analysis we've done is including the costs for both the embodied carbon analysis, not the change in materials, right? Because at this point, all that's required is disclosure. So we've got those costs sort of were high level assessed. Shawn spoke to that piece. And then of course, we've done a much more detailed analysis on the incremental costs of designing to emissions neutral standard in our construction. And we've been pretty, I would say, pretty conservative in, I guess the opposite of conservative, pretty generous in suggesting how much more should be included for budgeting purposes in that sense. So yeah, it's in place, and for new construction, it's pretty well known within the City of Edmonton team that those incremental costs have to be considered.
Excellent. And then now there's one about retrofits. Will this change the way we approach retrofits in existing city buildings?
Yeah, not today. That's actually a big piece of the policy that we're still working on, is looking at our retrofit strategy and our operational carbon reductions in our city facilities, and how we approach the hundreds upon hundreds of buildings we have. And I don't think we actually explicitly stated this, but the City of Edmonton has an even more aggressive target for our emissions reductions than the overall community. Ours is a emissions neutral corporation by 2040. So 10 years before the rest of the community, we're expected to be there. So the work we're doing right now is focusing on reducing the operational carbon in our existing buildings. But I have no doubt that at some point we're going to be looking at how we make decisions around our existing buildings when it comes to retrofitting, and specifically when it looks at replacement of assets as we move forward. We're not there yet, but it's definitely on our mind.
Great. Lots of good questions. How can we talk to the city for providing education on this?
There's an email address at the end of this presentation. Sustainable Building Team at edmonton.ca. We don't do formal training, that's not really in our mandate, but we're very happy to talk to people about what we're doing. So yeah, reach out and we'll see what's possible.
Excellent. I am noting that email myself. Will LCAs conducted by, for like the CAGBC zero carbon framework or for LEED, will those be accepted, or does a separate LCA need to be done?
We haven't actually officially discussed that point, but I would be very surprised if we asked for an additional one, unless there's some major discrepancies between them. But I think those are sort of the gold standards anyways, for the most part, from what I understand. So we probably would be happy to see those.
Makes sense, makes sense. How are you going to be working with developers for the A4 and A5 module information?
Can you tell us? That's a really good question.
It is. Matt, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. As far as availability of LCA information, modules A4 and A5 are probably some of the least researched and least available types of or portions of the building life cycle as far as the LCA information goes. So there's a lot of work that the entire industry needs to do to flesh out a lot of the pieces around modules A4 and A5. So just bear that in mind as you work forward with your plans here, in that there's not only is there a major data gap there, but there's a lot of education needed to even start filling that data gap.
Great. We will keep that in mind, and we will continue to learn about it. That's exactly the type of thing we're looking to learn about. So thank you.
Fantastic. Another question from Richard. Will the City of Edmonton allow the use of captured carbon to be used in a concrete mix to help offset the embodied carbon in concrete?
Shawn, want to talk about this one? I've talked to these folks, I think.
Yeah, definitely, using CO2 injection in curing concrete would be something interesting that we would look at and look to try. But definitely we haven't done it so far. I don't think it's even been contemplated for any of our projects, but if someone proposed it, it would definitely be something we'd look at.
I would say it, we don't often talk loudly about this, but the city, we do pilot projects every once in a while to learn about new technologies. And so, we're always open to discussions, I would say.
Excellent. Well, that answers that question. And now Zara is talking about next steps. And by all means, if you want to raise your hand and kind of have discussion like Anthony, by all means, but I'm just reading the chat ones while they're there.
As well,
Oh, sure.
No
Great.
problem.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I had two questions on the next steps that you mentioned. So one of the next steps was providing clarity on and guidance on how to conduct the embodied carbon. So I'm just curious to know if you're considering developing some sort of guideline on kind of clarifying how the material quantities are estimated, and then also just to make sure that what you get is apple to apple, like as you were talking about that benchmark, that was kind of like a wide range and wide scope and wide steps of the project. So that's one. And my second question is about the EPDs and availability of PCRs that you mentioned, that you'll reach out to local entities to find out about that. And I'm just curious whether you have or are doing any engagement with existing initiatives like the National Research Council, LCA2, and then also some existing tool providers who have digged into these EPDs like EC3 or One-Click LCA.
Good questions. So I think these are to answer your first question, that was actually something that we discussed quite a bit into development of the policy, is like at what level of depth did we want to start by asking? And I've read numerous reports, including one I believe you wrote about the details of what we should be asking for, and how it would basically allow us to get better data. And I think after numerous discussions, our decision was that we kind of feel like we need to figure that out for ourselves a little bit first, because we didn't feel like we were well enough versed in this work as a city to be asking for such stringent things and not really understanding what that will look like. So that's part of the disclosure process for us at this point, is just, I know it would be nice if we could just read the reports coming out of Vancouver and other jurisdictions and say, well, of course we should do this, but we're not. To be honest, I'm not there yet. We're not there yet in the work that we're doing. So it's part of that piece. It's not just about the city. It's all like in our ability to process this data. It's also about the industry, right? So we want to see what industry is doing. We want to see like what the capacity is currently at in Alberta for this type of work, and allow them to sort of grow with us in that work. So I think the answer is yes, eventually. I suspect we will be needing to set those types of expectations and requirements, especially if we want sort of standardized expectations for hitting targets or standards, just as other jurisdictions are finding, but we're not quite there yet.
Just adding, fair point. No, I mean, I guess what you're saying is absolutely correct. I based on at least what I saw in Vancouver experience, just starting it was a big shift of the industry. So I would echo what you said, that just having everything in place to get started may make it too late. So 100%, your approach is a reasonable one.
But it's funny because I keep trying to add more detail, and Shawn's like reining me in, saying, no, let them learn. Let us learn together. And so the other piece, your question was around EPDs and PCRs. At this point, no, we haven't sort of like dove into that pond yet. And it's primarily because we haven't even started that work, right? Like we don't have our first building yet. It should be coming pretty soon. But because of budget cycle alignment, like we just have this group of projects that will start up pretty soon here. And with that, we'll be learning more about the EPD databases and groups and resources as we work with our consultants on that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for presenting again. I also echo everybody's. It's very exciting that you're putting it in the policy. It's just a great start to move ahead.
Thanks.
Agreed. Eric, are you there to ask your question? I can ask on your behalf. I'll just start to start the ball rolling. Is there any desire or intent to align procedures with other Alberta jurisdictions, Calgary and others, especially in the future when requirements are extended beyond City of Edmonton infrastructure? Great question.
Yeah, and I can start, and if you want to chip in whatever else too, Andrea. So I'm not sure what Calgary's sustainability policy is, but in terms of the emissions neutral building work, that operational group that I kind of talked about in my presentation, we heard from that group who does work, like some members in that group work all over Alberta. There's home builders that work in Edmonton and Calgary. There's consultants and people in industry that work in both jurisdictions and outside of our major cities as well. So there we wanted to try and align what we were doing if we were setting GHGI targets or demand intensities to kind of align with the provincial or national code wherever it was going to. There isn't really anything like that for embodied carbon, which makes it a little more difficult to coordinate at that provincial level as well when it comes to embodied carbon. But ideally, I think we'd like to see it. So there's desire there. Intent, we'll see what we can do.
Great. Last chance for questions. We're pretty good on time. Nice job, everybody. All those questions, and we got those all within 5 after. But if there's not, I will just remind you all about our next event. So hopefully everyone can see that coming up on November 4th. We'll be talking about the circular economy. But a huge thanks to the City of Edmonton. Thank you guys for coming out and sharing that with us. I echo everyone's thoughts about an exciting future, and we look forward to hearing more. It sounds like there'll be lots of milestones and changes, so we'll have to have you guys back, I think.
Justin, sorry to interrupt. I just had a quick one, if maybe Andrea doesn't mind to answer.
Ooh, I see another one in the chat too. Yes.
Speaking to disclosure and dealing with EPDs and so forth, has the City of Edmonton done more or can give more information around the extent of disclosure, meaning type 3 EPDs, product and material specific EPD versus industry averages?
Yeah, we've been getting into the weeds of it and that discussion recently as well. The way we currently have the language in the PSA, we're looking for type 3, but we haven't gone into any more details about exactly what we're looking for there. We've also noted that, like, it's if available. At this point, like, we know that not every product necessarily has it available. So I think back to sort of my earlier comment, it's more about us trying to learn and work with industry on that and sort of map that out a bit more as we proceed. I was neck deep in documentation trying to figure out what exactly we had to require, and again, Shawn pulled me back and said, let's just wait and see what industry provides and figure out where we go from there, right?
There's one more question from Ian in the chat. I don't know if you're still there, Ian, and wanted to ask in person. Okay, I'm going to start just in case. When calculating embodied carbon for the whole life cycle of a building, do the calculations include an adjustment to account for the loss of CO2 captured for wood products? So unless there is an assumption that more trees are planted than are cut down, is this loss captured between mature trees and seedlings over a given period? Is this accounted for?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a question I've always wondered how that plays into the calculations and if it's considered. So
When it comes to our policy work, at this point, we're not at that level. Maybe there's other people who have had experience.
Does Anthony or somebody want to comment on this one? Like,
I think Anthony could answer this.
I figured I was going to get pulled into this. Okay, so the conservative way of doing this would be to not account for biogenic carbon. That's like a whole different aspect. And okay, so let me just see. Yeah, so typically when we're doing an LCA with wood products, we're focusing on the fossil fuel related emissions. So like to cut down the tree, to like transport it, to manufacture, process, heat up the kiln, all that stuff. So we're quantifying those emissions. And then sometimes you see whole building LCAs where they're including stored carbon. So they're estimating how much carbon content is in that wood and translating that into CO2 stored in the wood product. And probably an overly optimistic approach would be to then multiply that by a -1. And then that's how sometimes you see these carbon negative numbers when it comes to biogenic calculations. And then certain whole building LCA tools. And so in whole building LCA tools or case studies, you need to be mindful as to what those assumptions were, whether or not they applied that negative credit or not. Then some of the whole building LCA tools sometimes have different end of life assumptions, which get very detailed into like what fraction of the wood gets landfilled, what fraction of it gets like decomposed and turns into methane and whatnot. And so they may have more complex modeling assumptions around that, and some of that may be stored more permanently and some of it more temporarily. So long story short, I think there's some discrepancy in terms of how people do these whole building LCAs. I think the most conservative approach would be to not account for it at this point. There's a whole other topic around biogenic carbon as to like what's happening in the forest, how we're managing it, and how do we capture those emissions. But I would say that's a very active area of inquiry right now amongst experts.
right, okay, yeah. I mean, it pops into my mind because with all the wildfires and everything going on and trees getting cut for in a variety of different countries to make more land for farming and so on and so forth. Obviously, the more trees we cut down, the bigger problems we have. And I was just thinking with respect to when it comes to building construction, as long as, say, for example, in Canada, we're planting more trees than we cut down, or twice as many or whatever it might be. I don't know what the policies are. If you plant one tree for every one you cut down, obviously a seedling isn't going to give you as much carbon capture as a full-grown tree. So, but if you have to plant 4 trees for each one you cut down, then who knows, maybe it offsets it with time. But it would seem to me as if you're not doing that, you're not really you're accounting for the embodied carbon as best you can, whether it's a simplified method or a complex method, but you're not accounting for potentially the damage of cutting down the trees. Again, if you plant way more than you cut down, then it's not an issue, but just something to consider. And I think
this is a hot topic that always comes up. So I'm just going to post a link to a talk that I did if you want to dig into it, but I don't want to detract away from this Edmonton discussion. So
I was going to say, I think you're doing a talk on it, and I've seen it come up at a lot of the green building conferences. So doing like wildfire, not only climate resilience, but the protection. So yeah, post away, and we can make sure to share that on our LinkedIn page as well.
Right. Yeah.
So glad Anthony's here. So glad. Okay, I think we're over time, so if it's okay, we'll wrap it up. But of course, we're always available for questions. Visit the webpage. The volunteers are listed there. You can reach out at any time. You can see us in our backgrounds here if you want to catch our names. And then once again, a huge thank you to City of Edmonton, Andrea, Shawn, and Justin. Thank you, and have a great evening. We'll see you guys on November 4th. So we're going to catch up with circular economy and circular design, and life cycle thinking. So see you all in a month. Have a good evening.